Good morning, everybody. And welcome to this meeting of the Audit Committee. I think we're all here, but I just say we're expecting Malcolm Benny to join us on the call. Malcolm, of course, is the new Director of Police. Turning to the agenda, any apologies?
No, convener, all members are present.
And item 2, any declarations? Are there any declarations of interest? No, being none. I move to item 3, which is the minute of the Audit Committee held on the 20th of September 2021. And that's on pages 3 to 9 of your papers. Are there any questions regarding these minutes, or are we happy to approve them as an accurate record?
Agreed.
Any matters arising from that which we're not going to be discussing at this meeting? Alison?
It's not really regarding the minute, but it was really just, obviously it's a long time since we had our last audit committee meeting, and its audit committee is really important. So I've got an assurance that this year we'll have the meetings, at the time we're supposed to have them, and as frequently as we're supposed to have them, because it is really important that we do that.
I'm sure we'll endeavour to do that, Alison. The main reason why we didn't have the meeting in November or beginning of December was because the auditor's report wasn't quite with us, and that would have been the substance of in our audit meeting cycle. That would have been the substance of that for this year. So we know what you see.
It may be just worth adding that the November meeting would have had some of the internal audit progress and corporate risk reports. What we'll do is there aren't any more meetings scheduled between now and the end of the year, but we'll add in an extra meeting of the audit committee to make sure that all of the outstanding work is picked up and dealt with before the committee finishes its cycle ahead of the local government elections. So nothing will be missed out.
Thanks, Brian. Any other issues? Can we move to the substance of today's meeting, and that's item 4, which is the annual accounts. And this is a report by the Director of Corporate and Housing Services. Stuart, I assume that Brian would be introducing this. Thanks. Brian.
Thank you, convener, and good morning all. Convener, this is a very succinct and straightforward cover report that contrasts somewhat sharply with the 100 or so pages that sit behind it, with their inherent complexity and technicalities. I think the key thing to note is the auditor's unqualified certificate, which again is very welcome. And EY will no doubt wish to say more about what sits behind that when we come to the closely related next item on the agenda. I would just like to take the opportunity, as I did with the draft accounts last year, to again thank Danny and Amanda, together with their accounting teams, for the work that's gone into producing this document, and also to acknowledge the work of EY and our relationship with them. Convener, having said that, I would in conclusion just draw your attention to the recommendation at para 2, and of course happy to try and address any questions that members may have on the detail of the accounts sitting behind the cover report. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Brian, and can I just add my thanks again to yourself and your finance team and to the auditors for producing the document. We of course went through it at our September meeting when it was in draft form, and I don't think there's much more to say about that at the moment. I don't have any questions at the moment. Are there any questions from members regarding? All right, sorry, it's Grace coming in first.
I wasn't going to say anything at this stage. I'll just pick up when it's our actual report.
Have members have any questions regarding the accounts?
Convener, I don't know whether it's necessarily directly related to the accounts, but it is about our best value and good practice. I notice we've got Gary Greenhorn here. It's really about the rollout of the digital devices. And while we had a capital allocation available to provide that, and we were very fortuitous in the decision making at that time, considering where we are, how is that going to be managed going forward around replacement devices? Is there going to be a residual allocation available to look at replacement, repair, and things like that? And while I'm here, I'm just going to ask about the Council of the Future Closer to Home project. I appreciate that we've had significant challenges around the pandemic, but on a longer term basis, this project really needs to deliver, not just the financial savings, but the human aspects of it. And with the continual overspend, I'm really quite concerned that we're maybe not going to actually be able to get targeted approach and deliver on that programme.
Okay, Gary, would you like to pick up on that?
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. In terms of the first question, in terms of the digital devices, as mentioned in the...
Gary, I'm sorry, we can't hear you very well, but I can't. You sound as if you're at the bottom of a mountain.
Is that any better? I put the microphone up full. I'm having some difficulty this morning. What I'll do is I'll stop my video and talk if that...
Oh.
Is that any better?
No. Could you try moving the mic a wee bit closer to your mouth, Gary?
Okay. Is that any better now?
No.
I got new broadband installed on Friday and I'm having some technical difficulties, to be honest. What I'll do, Chair, is I'll log out and log back in.
Okay.
Vera, you might want to move on to someone else and come back to Gary.
Okay, and that's Kenneth, we want to pick up on the Council of the Future aspect of that, the closer to home strategy. I don't know whether, or do you want us to wait until Gary comes back in?
I'm happy to say a few words, Chair. We did bring a report on the closer to home strategy to the Education, Young People and Children and Young People's Executive. I think it was October or November, which set out the both the kind of policy drivers for what we were doing and why it was important, but also the savings that would flow from that. And members approved that report. But I think that what both we can see in the accounts, and perhaps more specifically in the following item, is the challenge we have on an ongoing basis in delivering savings in children's services. But clearly, if we're going to meet the kind of targets and financial challenges that we have, then delivering on closer to home is going to be absolutely fundamental to that. So in terms of the leader's comments, I absolutely agree the importance of that. It's clear from our financial statements that we still have a challenge in terms of delivering savings within children's services, but closer to home is absolutely key to that, and through the Council of the Future programme, we'll remain very focused on ensuring that's delivered. It's fundamental to both the best care and well-being of our vulnerable young people, and also it's critical to our in terms of our financial strategy.
Thank you, Kenneth. I don't see Gary back on yet. I've just before I go to Alison, can I just welcome Malcolm Benny, who's our new Director of Place. Malcolm, good morning, Malcolm, and thanks for joining on the call. Councillor Black, Alison, you had a hand up.
Yeah, it was with regards to closer to home, which is obviously a big issue and a big concern. But for me, is there not any way we can involve our partners? I'm thinking about, for example, the NHS. We've got like in Lochview, there's I think 2 of the wards are now closed, and that ward is a wrong term. It's 6-bedded units with private ensuite toilets, etc. Is there no way that we can actually use other resources, like from our stakeholders? I'm thinking as well about the great job that Housing did, and I'm not saying where this place should be. Obviously, I know there's a lot of that you have to be very careful because we're looking after vulnerable young people, and we need to make sure it's the right place. But we have blocks of flats in different parts of the district that have been, in Grangeworth, we renovated 2 blocks of flats a couple of years ago and it only cost £1.5 million. Is there nothing that we can do? Can we not look a bit wider? Maybe, you know, working with other departments, try and come up with a solution to this, because we've been looking at it for years, and I don't think it needs to be as difficult as we're making it.
Perhaps if I come back in on that through you, Chair. I mean, the reference to the development at Gary Place, I think, is a really important one, and that was a key part of the strategy. And Councillor Black, of course, is absolutely right in that all of this has to be done in the context of being sure that the solutions are right for the vulnerable young people in question. I think what I would say, and this was, I think, borne out by the presentation that was made to members by colleagues in Children's Services, is that we are looking at across the full range of options. We're very open to working with certainly housing, other partners, health, and indeed, if we're going to meet the scale of the challenge which is set out in the report that members approved back in the autumn, we will need to be looking at that full range of options. But as Councillor Black says, the key element is that these need to be the right solutions for the particular vulnerable children in question. So the point about openness, looking at the full range of options, absolutely accept that. And I'm very confident that our colleagues in Children's Services are very aware of that need and open to all of the possibilities. So I absolutely accept the comment from Councillor Black.
Thank you for that, Kenneth. Unfortunately, I see Gary's still having internet problems, so not back on. I have a question. Perhaps it's well, it's general, but it's related to the COVID-19, and I don't know whether maybe Brian can answer that. But I know that we're carrying forward 14.7 million from this year to next year to cover it. Given the ongoing problems, which are exacerbated by the now Omicron variant, do you think that 14.7 million is going to be enough to cover the COVID pressures for next year? And also, are there any prospects that you're aware of any additional government funding becoming available for that?
I think any additional government funding, as always, would be very welcome, but I don't think, other than support for businesses, which has been announced, there's anything specifically coming to us. I think you can trace the roots back for that to the decisions at Westminster, where the settlements down south, the budget down south, basically almost reflected a view that post the current year, COVID is not an issue. And of course, that's been reflected in the funding from Westminster through to the Scottish Government. So there's not additional COVID funding built into the overall grant system from Westminster to Holyrood, and then in consequence a lack of capacity for the Scottish Government in turn to have specific funds that could then potentially be passed on to local government. I think we all recognise the reality, as perhaps illustrated by Omicron, that it hasn't gone away, and there will be ongoing financial pressures stretching into next year, and indeed, no doubt, beyond. As you will recall, we as a council have effectively taken the decision to harness fiscal flexibilities to help manage the underlying COVID-related pressures, and harnessing those flexibilities will yield in the order of 7 million. And given our projected impact for COVID next year is in the order of 5 million, and bearing in mind the important linkage that you can only use the fiscal flexibilities for COVID-related expenditure, in unleashing this 7 million through fiscal flexibilities, we'll only be able to use that proportion in 22-23 that's attributable to COVID, which, as I say, we estimate is 5 million. And the balance, some 2 million or so, will look to carry forward to the year after, 23-24, to allocate towards COVID-related expenditure in that year. So overall, given the tools at our disposal, I think we're reasonably well placed, but certainly the capacity to harness fiscal flexibilities is a significant variable in that mix, and that will come together in the budget report that will come to council not too many weeks away from now. Hopefully that, at least in large measure, addresses your question, convener.
It does. Thank you, Brian, for that. I see Gary's back on the call. So just to remind you, this is in relation to the current funding and future funding for devices, which the leader raised. Gary.
Thanks, convener. Hopefully you can hear me a bit better now. Technology is a wonderful thing, provided it works. Just to say that it's a good question that the leader raised in terms of the successful rollout of the devices. Almost 16,000 devices have been rolled out. It was successfully completed just in the lead up to Christmas. In terms of the ongoing funding, those of you may know the Scottish Government have announced that they are going to provide revenue and capital funding during the lifetime of the Parliament just now for all councils to roll out devices. So at this moment in time, we are waiting to hear how they are going to do that, and to find out equally how much Falkirk are going to get from this. But our intention would be that with the money that we get from the government, able to effectively replenish, repair, invest in these devices on an ongoing basis in the future. So effectively, all things being equal, there should be hopefully no additional cost to Falkirk Council in the future.
Okay, thank you, Gary. It's still a good bit faint, but Cecil, are you happy with that?
Yeah, I'm content with that, but yes, Gary, just for your information, that the sound's still not great. We didn't want to keep on pestering you on it, but thanks for the answer.
I don't know whether, Gary, you want to come back on Closer at Home, or we did get
Just to say,
from Kenneth, a response to the question. I maybe ask Chancellor if she's happy with Kenneth's response.
Yeah, I have an understanding. There's still anxieties around that, but I don't know whether Gary could say anything a wee bit about the managing of the overspends within children's services.
Okay, Annie?
Thanks, Convener. Just to say to the leader that in terms of the current year's projection, there's a significant improvement in children's services position overall, and that would include the children and family service insofar as closer to home would be a major contributing factor to that. So at the current moment, we are projecting an underspend in children and family service, which, if all goes to plan, between now and the end of the financial year, I think it will be the first underspend that we've managed to achieve in several years. So I'll stop on that positive note, and we'll keep our fingers crossed that COVID-related and other ancillary pressures that we're dealing with are manageable between now and the end of the financial year to allow us to retain that positive position.
Convener, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. It's been a wee while. Yes. Any further questions on the accounts? There being none, and we move to the last item on the agenda, which is item 5, and it's the annual audit report. Again, Brian, I presume you will introduce this. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I'll speak very, very briefly to the short overview report before, with your agreement, giving the floor to Grace and EY to more fully explain the report to the committee. And as noted in the previous item, the auditors have provided a unqualified certificate to the accounts. So just picking out some of the headline items, starting off at the top of page 109, para 413, you can see there were 2 adjustments made to the draft accounts. I think it's fair to say, in terms of the first one with respect to asset valuation, that has been something of a running issue between ourselves and EY, but we have agreed to meet very shortly to look to try and expedite things for the next accounts run and reach an understanding at the front end and try and resolve some of the difficulties and impasses that have been encountered in this area. So I'm sure we'll find a way forward to smooth things for the next round. So there's very little in those terms to say, I think, with respect to the core accounts themselves. That then takes us to the wider scope set out in para 4.2 of the covering approach, and the wider best value considerations. And as will be evident, there's 4 dimensions to that assessment undertaken by the auditors. And of course, there is the very important and strong linkage with the wider best value review that's concurrent with this exercise. So just touching on, as indeed the paper does, the 4 dimensions under this wider review. The first one's financial sustainability, which the auditors have marked under their traffic light system, the RAG system, as red, reflecting concerns as to the scale of the budget gap, some 25 million, and the need to identify the means by which that can be bridged. And of course, that self-evidently is very pertinent, given, as was touched on a few minutes ago, the council's budget meeting not too many weeks away from now. They also note in that section a strong recommendation that the investment in the change fund is formally reviewed in terms of the return received from that investment. In terms of financial management, the next dimension, it's comforting to note that the auditors note the council continues to demonstrate good financial control, and that good progress was noted in updating key governance documents. And indeed, several of these will appear on the agenda for the forthcoming executive in January, just demonstrating that this indeed is moving forward. They also make comment on the capacity of the finance team, and as a way of assessing that, it's agreed, as reflected in the action plan and the appendix to the auditor's report, that an assessment will be undertaken against the SIPFA Financial Management Code. The third dimension to this is governance and transparency. And again, it's comforting to see a recognition that key features of good governance are in place and operating effectively. And also for the last one, value for money, very positive comments there, recognising that the council has responded to previous recommendations around the effectiveness of public performance reporting and the development of the website, and also the strong performance in relative terms, particularly in services of education and housing. So, as I say, this cover report just seeks to draw out some of the key themes from the more detailed audit report. And Convener, you'll no doubt come back to the recommendations in due course. But with your agreement, if Grace from EY would now pick up and set out more fully from the auditor's own perspective their assessment of the year just past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If it's okay with you, Chair, I'll just, I guess it's more about kind of putting meat on the bones because Brian's stolen lots of my thunder already. I guess the only main thing I was going to say is we expect the best value report to be published by Audit Scotland later this week. So throughout our report, we've tried not to replicate what Audit Scotland have already reported on, although as you'd expect, because of the specific duties around about particularly financial sustainability and financial management, there are areas of duplication, so we'll come on to that later on. In terms of the financial statements, first of all, then we conducted the audit of the financial statements in accordance with our annual audit plan as considered by the committee and tailored to the responses to those risks that we identified within the plan, including the risk of fraud in income and expenditure and the related risk that management could override internal controls. In this financial year, the Council also received substantial additional funds to meet the additional costs of COVID-19, and that created an additional income stream for us to review as auditors. But following sample testing and review, we were satisfied that there were no material misstatements around the treatment of income and expenditure or in relation to COVID grants. We were satisfied that they'd all been categorised correctly. We also look at journal entries. We conduct a lot of testing on journal entries just to make sure that there are no material weaknesses in the design or implementation of controls or any evidence of that override by management, and we found nothing to report there. On page 16 of our report, then we note that a new auditing standard actually came into implementation for this year on judgments and estimates. So that came into play and that had quite an impact on our audit approach, particularly for the valuation of property, plant and equipment and for pension liabilities. But overall, we were satisfied that there was no evidence of management bias in any of the testing of judgments and estimates. And while we did undertake additional testing for pensions and property, plant and equipment, no problems in terms of that application of judgments and estimates. Brian's already mentioned property, plant and equipment, and the council does hold significant assets within the balance sheet. I mean, it does total over £1 billion, and it is an area of complexity and audit interest within the financial statements. Members might recall that last year we had a significant adjustment as well in relation to the valuation of housing, council houses, but we've also processed another large adjustment this year. I would highlight that we have noted real improvement in the approach to revaluation this year, including the finance team actually drew on support from external experts to support the revaluation, and no adjustments were required in relation to the revaluation of housing this year. For schools, there is an area of complexity. Obviously, there isn't an open market for schools, and schools are therefore valued. It's called the modern equivalent asset methodology, because you can't just say a school is worth X. It's actually how much it costs to rebuild the school, and then it's discounted down for obsolescence factors, so including, for example, the age of the school. And as members will know, then we expected the cost of building to go up this year because of all the cost of building materials and the availability throughout the pandemic. So we did anticipate there would be a movement there. The council had actually already processed a large movement in terms of the value of the schools, but when the external valuer had provided a difference factor, then they didn't actually take into account the movements within the fixed asset register already. So it was a small error, but because of the value of schools, it had quite a big impact in terms of the numbers on the accounts. As Brian said, one of the things we've kind of talked to the finance team about is that recommendation about continuing to tighten up that process, and we will work with the finance team in January, because it is really an area that won't go away. And in fact, last week the FRC reported that another audit firm would be fined in relation to failures in this area. So in terms of audit interest and audit risk, is still very much up there. But as I say, lots of improvements we noted this year, and hopefully for next year we will sort it out further. On page 19, we outline additional work that was required in relation to the council's pension liability. Every year we ask our actuaries to review the assumptions and the methodology applied to value the pension fund assets and the pension fund liability. A small judgmental difference was noted, but overall we concluded that the approach was appropriate. If I turn to the wider scope judgments, and this, as Brian said, has been very much carried out hand in hand with the best value review. On page 25, we summarise our judgments on financial sustainability, and this very much is one of the areas of duplication with the best value report. And I'm sure that as the budget preparations are well underway, that concerns about that scale of the budget gap are not a surprise. But as we highlight in exhibits 2 and 3, we are concerned that the budget gap continue to move significantly over a short period of time, and that the related requirement for savings to be found therefore increased significantly again between May and October last year. We note on page 28 that the council was only able to achieve 59% of the planned savings in 2021, largely due to the impact of COVID-19. But as I think we discussed earlier, then one of the areas that we're concerned about is that some of the planned savings, particularly in children's services, might not be achievable, which will then put pressure on other services and on the council's reserves. If I turn to financial management, in prior years we've assessed this as green, reflecting really our view that the council manages its in-year budget position well. And in 2021, again, a small surplus was achieved despite overspends within children and families and development services. So there are really kind of three areas that influenced our assessment this year to assess it as amber rather than that green. The first is the capital programme, which has features in the best value report as well, just in terms of the significant slippage achieved in year again. And our view that the projections for 21-22 are unlikely to be achieved. We also carried out additional testing, both on procurement across the council and in relation to a specific service in response to whistleblowing allegations, where we found weaknesses in internal control, and that's an area that we and internal audit will follow up in this financial year. And finally, as we highlight on page 35, we are starting to highlight concerns in relation to the capacity of the finance team, particularly as a result of the imminent retirement of Brian and Stuart. And I guess the new expectations and new requirements. So, for example, this year there was a big impact on the capacity of the finance team because of the processing of COVID grants, but also vacancies within internal audit. And those expectations are continuing to rise. So, for example, there is the new SIPFA Financial Management Code. There is a new Prudential Code and a new Treasury Management Code. So, I guess that in terms of all those factors alongside the criticality of the financial plan and monitoring those savings, then we felt it was useful to kind of highlight it as an area of concern for audit now, rather than speak in hindsight next year. If we turn to governance, as in prior years, we were satisfied that the Council's governance arrangements remain appropriate, and actually we've drawn attention to improvements that were made despite, I suppose, in some ways because of COVID, so including the streaming, but also the new deep dive risk-related reviews that are being undertaken by the Scrutiny Committee. And finally, as part of our work on value for money, we consider the Council's performance reporting arrangements under the Accounts Commission's SPI direction alongside the service performance in the year. And as we highlight, and I think Brian mentioned as well, there is a new website, the Falkirk Performance website, which we think is a new step forward in terms of that performance reporting. And as Exhibit 9 highlights, then the Council services continue to perform well, particularly as Brian mentioned, housing and education. I think the last thing I would like to comment on before I open up to questions is about Councillor Black's comments and about the timetable, which I think I probably speak for the finance team as well as our team. We would really like to get back into a more even keel for the reporting date. Audit Scotland have suggested the 31st of October as the deadline date for let me get my years right, 21-22, and we would certainly like to meet that just to try and get back into the more kind of usual timescales, although still very much COVID environment, but I hope we're getting better at dealing with it. I'll pause there, but I will happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Grace, for a very comprehensive report. I'll open up the questions now. Okay, Cecil, I think your hand was up first. Councillor Michael John, thank you.
I think there's two things, or three things for me is around the workforce and capacity. I mean, I absolutely do share the concerns with staff leaving and making sure we have a robust timetable for actually recruiting. But also have to recognise that that's likely to be, that there's likely to be some new people come in, whether it's having to backfill those that perhaps apply internally or those that come externally. That's something that's going to be quite critical. But for me, the audit committee's been, the audit team have been carrying a vacancy for some time, and the timescale for appointing there, it seems to be extremely drawn out, and as a result, I think that we may start to see some slippage, and potentially that there are risks then in the work of the audit team. And I'm really pleased to hear the comments, particularly around the management of the COVID grants, because our corporate fraud team again aren't fully resourced, and that's another concern. But I think there are some positives in there, as Grace has highlighted. There are some improvements, but we are going to go into a very challenging period. I think we see that with the budget gap that we have. Therefore, the greater scrutiny of how we do spend our finances is going to be something of priority going forward. So I'm really looking for assurance that we can get our finance teams resourced up as quickly as possible, and that we don't have too many more delays in doing that. And that again, that should help to resource this committee and the information coming forward.
Thank you, Cecil. pick up on that? Ryan, I think, is it? Yeah. I can ask Brian, can you pick up on the corporate fraud and the internal audit aspect?
I mean, certainly as in terms of that particular team, we are currently recruiting for an auditor. I have to say the response has been somewhat thin, so we'll have to evaluate what that means. But due process is being followed with best endeavours to have the post filled as quickly as possible. In terms of the corporate fraud team, we've been impacted by, it's a very small team, and we've been impacted by long-term sickness by one of the members of that team, whereas the other has reduced her hours. So we'll need to take stock in terms of, given that backcloth, how best we manage capacity going forward. But inherently, it is a small team. And you know, against a backcloth of the financial pressures that have been majored on in this meeting, the size of the gap, one just needs to recognise that there isn't the ready financial headroom that might have existed in previous times to have the headroom to simply resolve problems by recruiting more people. I know in finance, and we're not alone, but we've sought to, over the years, because these financial pressures have existed for well over a decade, we've sought to take a lead, you know, give an example of restricting our cost base, and you know, there are consequences of doing that. So it's about managing your resource with the objective of achieving maximum impact and effectiveness with what is a limited resource. But that's just the reality of the operating environment that we face.
Thanks, Brian. Kenneth, some comment to make there?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I do pay very close attention to what EY have said about finance team capacity. We do recognise the need to make appointments to the senior post quickly. We're going to be advertising for the Chief Financial Officer post next week, as agreed by the Council in December. We will be coming back with an early proposal in relation to the Director post, and we very much recognise the challenge of transition with two very senior, very experienced officers leaving the Council. On the broader piece of work, and Brian has touched on this, you know, over the years, in terms of savings that have been brought forward, we have cut back significantly in corporate areas, finance, HR, governance, others. And as members are aware, we are not bringing forward proposals this year which would see further cuts in these areas, because actually you do need to have core capacity, both to deal with the ongoing running of the business, but also to provide that resource that helps us in our transformation program, because these core functions are critical to the future transformation of the Council. So certainly as, you know, as Chief Executive, I'm acutely aware of the comments that EY have made in relation to that. I think both in terms of our recruitment and review of the finance function and how that sits within the broader corporate team, these are really important issues which we're very aware of, Jan.
Thank you, Kenneth. Cecil, did you want to come back in there?
Yes, it was just very briefly a wee bit to ask Brian on what are the challenges that we are experiencing in getting somebody interested or somebody of suitable quality interested within the audit position. Is there a barrier to that, and is there anything that we can do to improve that?
Convener, through you, in speaking to colleagues in other councils and indeed in other organisations allied with anecdotal information, there just seems to be, to use my earlier word, a thinness in the market across a range of positions, and that stretches to senior positions, middle positions, and more junior positions. There just seems to be a greater demand than there is supply, and that just seems to be a prevalent market condition at the moment, and we're not immune to that. I've had a conversation even just yesterday with or an email exchange with Isabel on this, and thinking about alternative ways by which this can be managed, and one potential way is around growing your own. Now, there are downsides to that, fairly obvious downsides in terms of it takes time to train somebody up, but if the market's against you, you do need to think more broadly as to how you might address those conditions. So we're looking at it creatively, if I can put it that way. But what you don't want to do, I would suggest, and from hard experience, I would certainly subscribe to, you don't want to fill the post for the sake of just filling it, because you'll pay the price for that downstream. And I'm sure we all have examples that would reinforce and evidence that point. So we need to be careful in our recruitment. We need to recognise the reality of the market, and we need to find creative solutions as to how we deal with those challenges.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, Cecil, I've got Councillor Nimmo to be followed by Councillor Spears.
Thanks, Nigel. Just a couple of points, if I can draw your attention to page 45 in the report, and it's the item at the bottom of the page headed up as unusual supplier analysis. Now, it's highlighted here that we have 5 contractors who are submitting a very high number of invoices, with 3 of these contractors submitting over 5 invoices per day. Now, bearing in mind that it's over 5, so that number could be relatively quite high as opposed to the 5. Why are we allowing this? Basically, what are we doing to stop this? And what are the value of the contracts that we're talking about here? Is there significant amounts of money involved in these contracts? But I'm more interested in how we're managing this, or how we're not managing it. Because there must be better ways of dealing with this. Thanks, Convener.
Could I take that?
Yeah,
Convener?
Grace.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess that this is quite early results of this procurement analysis, because there is obviously quite a lot of data that sits behind it, and we are trying to work out what's the best way of talking this through with the finance team to kind of get into it in quite a lot of detail without, for example, putting that report in the public domain, because it's, it would become FOIable and all that kind of difficulty. But where we have got concerns about the data that's kind of come up, then we have discussed that with internal audit, and so they're going to take that on particularly. In terms of that unusual supplier analysis, then in a number of cases they relate to contracts where we're already kind of investigating. We already kind of don't understand some of the aspects of those contracts, and so that is an area of work that's continuing just now. And I suppose that what I suppose I'm trying to say is this is a kind of holding response. The work that on this isn't complete yet, and once it is complete, then we'll be reporting back to committee on it.
Thank you, Grace. Stuart, you the hand up there.
Thank you, Chair. This is an area that's on our radar. We have got a team, a cross-service team, looking at how we can improve our purchase to pay arrangements. And we've been working with a number of suppliers to reduce the frequency and the amount of invoices that they submit. At the end of the day, we can't force contractors into this. They will do what suits them for their business purposes more than what suits us for our business purposes. So it's a bit of a dialogue, if you like, to try and see how we can improve things. What we're trying to do is to try and get as much automated as possible, whether that's through the use of electronic means, electronic purchase orders, electronic invoices, whether it's use of purchase cards, all of which is about improving the efficiency of the purchase to pay system, which I guess is the question that Councillor Nimmo is driving at. So I guess that I would just want to give committee some comfort that it's on our radar in general terms, that we're looking to try and improve efficiency in this area. And we've already made some good efficiencies, but there's more work to be done. And as Grace has said, there's more dialogue to be had between the finance team, the creditors team, EY and internal audit.
Thanks, Stuart. Coming back again, Alan, yeah?
Yeah, just another quick point, Nigel. I'm even more concerned now, going by what I've just heard. But what I've just heard, we seem to be letting contracts without understanding what's actually contained in them. And that's a real worry. The contract itself will dictate to the contractor what they're expected to do. So if we're looking for one invoice instead of 5, that can be detailed in the contract, and the contractor has to abide by that legally. Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Grace, would that be you or Stuart too?
Yeah, I'm happy to come back on that, Convener. It's not always the case that contracts will stipulate what the payment method is, and you got to bear in mind that what we've got is we're operating as one entity, but there are multiple different purchase points within the Council of Dick Schools, just as an example. So, you know, just going back to the answer that I gave earlier, what we're trying to do is to have a conversation with those suppliers who have significant volume of invoices with us to try and see if we can come up with a smarter basis of dealing with purchase to pay arrangements. It'd be fair to say, though, that there's been an impact on these discussions over the course of the last 2 years, and the COVID impact both at the council and with our suppliers, and that's meant that we haven't made as much progress as we wanted to have done, but we have made progress. But as I say, it's on our radar, and it's something that we'll continue to pursue.
Thank you, Stuart. Okay, can I move on then? Councillor Spears, followed by Councillor Black.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 questions. With the Bank of England being the first major bank to increase interest rates, will this have a knock-on effect to obviously the finances of the council? And my second question is, with Michael Gove, the government minister at Westminster, saying that COVID is on the pathway to be the new norm, and there is no forthcoming finance to help us, And I know a lot of people, we're one of the biggest employers locally, and people are going to be catching COVID at the present rates. It's the transmission rate is enormous. How are we going to be able to finance when people are off shielding?
Okay, don't know. On the financial aspect, would that be, Brian, would you care to respond? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, interest rates were always going to head north, given where they were sitting, and we've had the first step, but 0.25%, particularly for those of us who recall a time when they were 15, 16, 17%, is not of itself that significant. Our long-term borrowing is locked into fixed term and not subject to variable rate. And with interest rates, there's two sides to the coin. So if you're in a borrowing situation, then okay, your costs are going to go up. But if you're a lender, your situation is improved. And in terms of our cash management, as opposed to our long-term capital borrowing, we are in, and have been for some time, because of our reserves position, which in turn is in large measure driven by the COVID grants, in credit or surplus. So we are laying cash off in the market. So the rise in interest rate, albeit marginal in those terms, is helpful. So the short answer is no, it's not a problem, but we do need to keep an eye on the fact of the trend upwards in interest rates. And I suppose related to that, as we've already seen, the quite significant rise in more general inflation as well, which is going to feed through to our cost base. And that's not going to be helpful if it's not matched, which hitherto it hasn't been, by matching grant on the income side. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Is that you're happy with that?
I think it's good to remind us that our reserves are also there to benefit the council, especially as we head into budget deliberations. Then we need to see the reserves as something that's going to secure us for the future.
Okay. Robert. Alison. Councillor Black.
Thanks, Convener. I think it is it's going to be a big loss to the council. Brian Smale and Stuart Ritchie leaving. I think we'll all feel their loss in a lot of ways. And it's worrying about the lack of capacity in finance and the audit teams. Regarding the audit position, I know that in the Health and Social Care Partnership, there was significant delays, I mean, a long delay in getting the actual waiting for the position to be agreed between HR and the senior team in the Health and Social Care Partnership. And that it led to a long dialogue for months and months before the actual position was agreed on, and the salary, because our council puts quite a lot of weight on how many people you manage, rather than the skills and the qualifications that you've got to do the job. So I think maybe I don't know if that's something that needs to be looked at. Maybe if Brian could have a think about that. And the other thing I think that was significant for me in the report was the Chief Finance Officer and his role in procurement and in the capital programme, because I think for me as an elected member, I have found that sometimes you've got to really dig deep at meetings to actually find out figures and things like that. And I think that he should have a pivotal role in any type of planning, including your capital spend and your programme and your big ticket items, etc. So I think obviously because there's such a big implication for the revenue budget, sometimes I think that wasn't recognised enough in regards to the HQ, and with the trust being brought in house as well. So I think that's been really important. I think that you've answered the question really well about fully, Grace, in the terms of the procurement and the invoicing, etc. And I hope that the work that's been done by the head of house and the procurement is going to be enough to make a difference. Do you think that will be the case? So that was really all I wanted to ask her. Say.
Brian, you're going to pick up on that. Thank you.
Maybe just on a couple of points that Alison made there. Just from my perspective, you know, the comments around the HQ and the trust, the HQ finances comments and views on the project have been fed in all the way along, and it's part of the corporate evaluation of the project and the information provided to members. So I, from a personal and professional point of view, have no issue there. And on capital, finance are centrally involved in the preparation and management of the capital programme. So again, not an area that I feel there's a particular issue. As always, there's scope for finesse, refinement and improvement, but substantively I wouldn't be flagging any concern on those areas that were mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Does that answer your question, Alison? Can I maybe just
could I just ask about the HR side of things? Is that something that Brian's looked at in regards to making sure that that's not an issue in terms of salary, etc., for the person that you're looking for?
I mean, in terms of a particular post will have gone through objective job evaluation and a grade derived, and that will be consistent with the market position for that post. So before it goes out to the market, it will have gone through that due, for any post, will have gone through that due process. So the grading will have been objectively determined. I think the issue, as I was trying to suggest earlier, isn't necessarily the grading or salary per se. It's just there's more supply, there's more jobs on the market than evidently there are demand or people interested in the jobs, which is resulting in the sort of limited responses that you're tending to get from your adverts.
Brian, does that answer your question, Alison? Yeah. Okay, just to come back to Brian on the says you've no concerns about the financial services involvement. There is, I'm just trying to find the page, but there is some disquiet raised in the auditor's report in terms of best to describe it as a non-joined up approach vis-a-vis the Council of the Future, and we seem to be running one financial service for Council of the Future and one for the Council. Yes, I've got the page here. Yeah. Need to balance the demands and capacity of financial resources. No, that's not quite the right page, but I think we have raised some members have raised concern about the financial management of Council of the Future, almost as a distinct entity from the normal revenue and capital account. I don't know whether Brian would like to comment on that, because there is a recommendation made within the auditor's report that when we look at the new finance officer post, that these processes might be reviewed. So I don't know whether that would be Brian or Kenneth to comment on that. Kenneth, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It relates, I think, to page 146, where it talks about finance team capacity. And what it does, it refers back to the external review that we had of the Council of the Future programme in the early part of last year, and talked about the connectivity between the finance team and that programme of work. And that indeed is one of the recommendations that came out of that review, and one of the areas of work that we have been looking at in terms of delivering on these outcomes. And indeed our proposal this year, and I think this is also reflected in the report, I'd struggle to find the page for that particular point, is that we're bringing forward the new business plan alongside the budget report at the beginning of March. So that is to ensure that there's that absolute connectivity between the two. So I think that, and Grace may wish to comment, but I think that in terms of the audit report, it was picking up on that specific recommendation, which had been part of the external review. We recognise the need to deliver on that recommendation, and bringing the two pieces of work together as part of the budget report to Council in March is a means of ensuring that that is done. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Kenneth. So that reassurance is helpful. Tessel, you've got your hand up again.
A final question, convener, and it's just about clarification around the audit fees, and that we have the additional audit procedures is to be confirmed. Now, I don't want to be appearing to be penny pinching, but we do have to look after the pennies as much as the pounds. Our budgets are very financially pressured, but when are we likely to know what our audit fee for this year is? What is likely to be that, even an indicative of the additional audit procedures? Is it likely to be more or less than the previous years? And just out of interest, there was a slight difference in the audit support costs from last year to this year. It was less this year than last year, so I just wondered a wee bit of explanation around that.
Thank you.
I'll take that. Sorry.
Grace, thanks.
I'm trying to think about what the outline fees are. So this is related to the work that is still ongoing and has been conducted by our forensics team. So I think until that work is completed and we've shared the results with the council fully and agreed on kind of next steps, then I don't think there is an actual agreed position. I mean, ideally we would have had this agreed so that when this report goes to the council, then it would be there. But I take your point about actually we could put in indicative numbers that might be helpful. In terms of the audit support costs, then actually this is the part of the audit fee that goes to Audit Scotland. So last year, as you know, Audit Scotland, all the auditors were working remotely. So usually when auditors are conducting work, then there's a lot of expenses. So for example, the auditors that will do Shetland or will do the Western Isles councils, then there are quite significant costs because of that. That weren't incurred last year. So my understanding is that this is them trying to kind of recognise some of that across the audit fees for all the councils. You kind of take out those costs that won't be necessary. So I guess that's the bit that goes to Audit Scotland though, rather than our piece. So I think this is a kind of timing thing in terms of how much this will end up costing, but you make sure that that's visible, particularly within our audit plan for next year.
Thanks, Grace. Happy with that? Are there any further questions on this item? Further comments? That being the case, I'll be happy to return to the recommendations. One, that we note the annual audit report for 2020-21 and note the action plan appended to the audit report. Happy to do that. Alan? No?
Yeah, agreed.
Agreed. And just for the sake of the minute, and prompted by Brian's helpful comment about 15 minutes ago, we should in fact return to page 11 of the papers and agree the recommendation at 2.1, which is the committee, which we didn't do formally, asked to consider and recommend to Council that the audited annual accounts of the Council to 31st March 2021 are approved. Are we happy to approve?
Agreed.
Thank you very much for your time and your contribution. And can I thank, again, thank the our own finance team, our own internal audit team, and our external auditors, EY, for all the hard work we've done. And I just hope that in response to Councillor Black's query about the timing, I see we're still going to slip by a month perhaps, but let's hope we can, well, it will not be, perhaps not be us, but let's hope that we can meet to do this at the end of October this year. Thank you very much again for your time. Have a good day.